the emerging market sustainability dialogues. Without further ado, I will hand over to Brigitte for the introduction. Brigitte, over to you.
Thank you so much, Georg. I would like to warmly welcome you all calling in from different places around the world, I assume. At least I'm aware of guests from South Africa, India, Nigeria, and Germany. But there are many more countries. Maybe if you quickly write into the chat which country you are from, where you are dialing in, would be very interesting to see how many countries we have here on the table. Well, EMSD, Emerging Market Sustainability Dialogues, is a program funded by BMZ and conducted by us as GIZ, and in a sense itself is a kind of incubator and knowledge platform for innovative solutions for sustainability in and with emerging countries. In particular, the program enhances and facilitates multi-stakeholder dialogues in those different topics, and we have prioritized 3 areas: sustainable infrastructure, sustainable finance, and last but not least, digital solutions for sustainability. And today we talk about this topic. And under this topic, EMSD basically looks into the question, how can governments, policymakers, and regulators create a sustainability-oriented, conducive policy and regulatory environment around platform economies. So why did we choose this topic? It's because it's an innovative and new topic, and because digital platforms are increasingly a central mechanism also in emerging countries. These platforms provide mechanisms to bring together a whole spectrum of actors for online transactions. And this was further boosted, of course, by COVID-19. And they became a central business model for today's biggest digital companies, such as we know Amazon, Facebook, Alibaba, Airbnb, Uber, and many more national, regional, and global platforms. So platform economies, as I have learned, transform entire economic sectors with high velocity. So 7 out of 10 most valuable companies worldwide are based on platform business models. So we have to face this challenge. So digital platforms have a tremendous potential. For example, they are, of course, decreasing barriers to access labor opportunities. However, they also bear many challenges, in which many cases have certainly a policy or regulatory dimension. And so they confront policymakers and regulators with new governance issues. So, for example, how to deal with the monopolistic tendencies that arise from platforms, networks, or how to tax companies, or regarding also labor relationships, are platform workers effectively independent and self-employed, or just marginalized? Are equal labor regimes for platform workers and employees desirable, or undermining growth potentials? So there are many challenges in this topic, and so we decided, in order to understand better the issues around this and also the potential solutions, we teamed up with our trustful partners, Cenfri and JustJobs, so both long-term partners of EMSD and of GIZ, far before I joined EMSD, actually, and of course with Cenfri also have this history far before EMSD also. So while Cenfri and JustJobs took a deeper dive into the topic, we also formed a joint working group, and this was a very exciting exercise. It was a joint working group within GIZ to accompany the study. And so this is very critical because GIZ has extensive expertise in this field of employment and digitalization, with a range of global, regional, and national engagements commissioned by BMZ and other donors in the field of employment promotion, vocational training and education, digitalization, cooperation with the private sector. Is cross-cutting and is touching many of our projects. So, GIZ programs and of course the Fair Work Foundation as well. So around this study, we started regular meetings to discuss our intermediary results of the study and also to gain further insights to improve also the study and the quality of the study. So we realize that this working group is a tremendous opportunity also to strengthen GIZ's internal network around labor issues in the platform economy and beyond that. So let me take the opportunity to thank you warmly, my colleagues from Cenfri, JustJobs Network, and all the working group members for the continuous engagement, fruitful discussions, and really valuable insights. So it was really enjoyable. So now we are at the point that the study has been completed successfully. All the inputs have been taken seriously and have come on board. And today we would like to share the results with the audience and also to invite speakers to have a kind of external view on those results and get into a kind of dialogue and discussion on the important issues. So we are very pleased now I'm very pleased also to welcome Albert and Sabina, who will give us a short introduction. And I also would like to quickly take the opportunity to thank the organizers. So it was, I think, a team of Cenfri and JustJobs Network, as well as together with the EMSD team, Max, Böge, and Le Gus, to all work together to make this little event, this on-site, this digital event possible for today. So I don't want to say more. Georg, I hand over to you, and I'm really looking forward to a very interesting, fruitful discussion. So thanks to all of you for being with us.
Thank you, Brigitte. And I will hand over to Albert and Sabina. Albert, Sabina, it's your turn now.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you, Brigitte. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you. With studies like this, there's always a lot of work that goes into formulating the concepts and doing the research, etc. But this is really an opportunity for us to present what we our insights on labor regimes and the gig economy with you. It's also a pleasure to be here with you from all over the world. I know we have people where it is morning, where it is afternoon, and where it is evening. It's one of the many advantages of having a digital meeting like this. So the topic of our study was, are labor regimes keeping up with the gig economy? The starting point was really to understand what options policymakers have to policies on the gig economy which protects the workers but does not stifle the development of the sector. I think as Brigitte articulated, we've seen with the fourth industrial revolution and the digital transformation of economies that there are many different economic opportunities arising in the digital economy. But then with that transformation also comes new unique risks. And that is what our study refocused on, the labor side of those opportunities and those risks. What we've seen in the global north often happen is that there is a pushback from policymakers against the platform economy and the absorption of labor into the platform economy, because it often seems like a more informalization of the formal economy as employment relationship contracts and relationships becomes weaker. In the global south, which was the focus of our study, we have a very different labor market context, where a significant part of the labor market participates in the formal economy. It's often a survivalist economy. So the platform economy or gig work provides an opportunity for people to access more structured and formalized employment relationships. So it's really this tension that we want to bring to the fore, and also the digital economy, the gig economy provides often better outcomes, potentially better outcomes for gig workers in Africa. The focus countries for the study in Africa were Kenya, Nigeria, and Rwanda. In Asia, we focused on India, Myanmar, Thailand, and the Philippines. The report examines in depth the extent to which the prevailing labor and social protection regimes provide coverage for platform workers in the case countries and make suggestions as to how to fill those gaps. But before we get to some of the results, let's just talk about definitions. So the concept of a digital platform is very broad, and it encapsulates many different types of platforms. So in the first instance, we have marketplaces, which contain selling platforms and rental platforms. If you think about platforms such as Amazon, Airbnb, even service rentals like Netflix. We have services platforms where you can think of location-based work, web-based work, or gig work, and then other intermediary services like job matching services, or other types of platforms like social media platforms, which can also facilitate economic opportunities. The focus of our study was on location-based work and web-based or cloud work, where within location-based work, we looked at transportation services, delivery and logistical services, household and personal services, and then in the web-based or cloud workspace, we looked at micro or freelancing services. Now, the main distinction, obviously, between location-based gig work and cloud-based gig work is location-based is really where the provision of labor services is specific location. E-hailing is a good example where you, even though you use the platform to facilitate the service, the service is delivered in a specific area. Where cloud-based gig work, the labor services can be extended remotely via the internet. So you do not necessarily have to have a geographical presence. What we did as a starting point is to try and scope the size of the online work economy or the gig economy and the types of platforms that facilitate gig work. Now, in general, there is a significant lack of data available on the platform economy in general, but this is particularly an acute problem in the global south. We relied on SEMrush traffic analysis. So what that data included is, it includes web traffic data and app traffic data to individual platforms. So we could see the number of visits that gig work platforms receive per day, and also the number of unique visitors. It didn't allow us to make the distinction between service providers and service consumers, but it did give us the ability to at least put some kind of scale on the usage on these platforms. What this graph shows is it gives an indication of the user base of the 10 largest platforms in February 2020 per country. The user base is determined by unique visitors. So on the x-axis, you have the user base per 1,000 adults, and on the y-axis, on the x-axis, you have the various countries. We didn't include the traffic analysis data on Myanmar was not available, and unfortunately, we included the Philippines after we acquired the data, so that's why those two countries aren't on the graph. In the pie charts at the bottom gives an indication of the distribution of the user base between location-based work and cloud-based work, where the green is the cloud-based work and the blue is the location-based work. So for instance, in India, we found that in the month of February 2020, there were 24 million users on the top 10 gig economy platforms, which amount to about 27 adults, 27 users per 1,000 adults. So activity on these labor platforms is still relatively small. The number of unique visitors to labor platforms in our focus countries, however, is starting to grow. And it's an indication of economic potential as more and more people start participating and visiting these platforms. Location-based work, as you can see with the domination of blue in the pie charts, location-based work is providing more opportunities than cloud-based work. In all of the countries except Kenya, that skew exists. Rwanda as well, though Rwanda, the user base is still very small. And I'll get into Kenya a little bit more in the next slide. So what kinds of work do people do on these platforms? So this graph specifically looks at freelance work. So the Oxford Institute compiles an online labor index which measures the supply and demand of online freelance work by occupation. We use the data for 2019. So this graph indicates the number of daily freelance gig workers as a percentage of the labor force for 2019. The y-axis shows the percentage of the labor force, the x-axis are our focus countries again, and then we also included the United Kingdom and the United States, just to give a relative comparison for the countries in the global south. Now, India has by far the largest number of daily workers on these freelance platforms. We see about 100,000, just more than 100,000 freelance workers per day. But it is still very small compared to the labor force. As you can see, it's about 0.018% of the total labor force in India participates on the main freelance platforms. In Kenya, what is interesting about Kenya, who has about 3,401 average daily workers on these freelance platforms, in Kenya, the majority of the freelance activities are writing and translation work. And we found this in a different study that we did with the MasterCard Foundation, as well as that in Kenya there's high demand for Kenyan writers and translators from the global north because the standard of English is so high. In India, we see that the blue part of the bar, which refers to software development and technology work, represents the biggest part of the freelance labor force. As I mentioned before, Rwanda and Myanmar is still pretty small. In Nigeria, it is starting to pick up, and we see a relatively even distribution between the type of work categories. And then if we compare it with the United Kingdom and the United States, the focus countries of this study is quite a bit lower, but it is starting to catch up. And I mean, even if India has, as a percentage of its labor force, is lower than the United Kingdom and the United States, you can see in absolute numbers, it is significantly larger. Sabina, I'm going to stop here and then hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much. I'll just share my slides. Do you see my screen? Okay.
I can't see your screen. There we go.
Okay, great. And sorry, just trying to. Okay. Just a quick word to say thank you to GIZ and Cenfri and the EMSD team for collaborating with JustJobs Network. It's been a real pleasure working with you all on this innovative and interesting study that tries to move the needle forward on the discourse of the large and growing gig economy. So I wanted to start by sort of picking up where Albert just left off, which is really, looking at so one of the new and innovative things about this study is that we actually tried to use different sources of data to piece together a relative size of the platform economy. And that came from the incentive for that came from the idea that if the platform economy is big enough and it's growing enough, then that should garner more attention from policymakers. And so I wanted to start this, the next part of this discussion by really busting some of the assumptions that underlie how we look and understand the gig economy today. And this picks up from where Albert left off, which is the assumption that the gig economy is still very small. It constitutes a small share of overall employment, so it doesn't matter. And maybe that sounds a bit flippant, but the idea is that we do see policymakers sort of just extending existing policies to the gig economy as if this particular emerging ecosystem of gig work doesn't have unique characteristics. And one of the things that our study tries to drive in is that there are characteristics that are unique to the gig economy, and the ambit of the different kinds of labor regimes that exist need to be expanded in order to accommodate this new reality of the emerging ecosystem of digital work. So yes, it's true that the platform economy still constitutes a small percentage of overall employment, but there is a lot of evidence that more and more people are relying on online work for either generating or supplementing their income. And of course, as Brigitte also pointed out, the pandemic is accelerating this trend. So, the gig economy itself has very low barriers to entry. And so in a post-COVID era, we are likely to see, as other jobs and sectors decline, a greater concentration of workers in the gig economy. And this sort of oversupply of labor, because of the low barriers of entry, will exert downward pressure on wages and working conditions, especially in the global south. And so this is something to be mindful of when we're looking at labor regimes and the kinds of protections that are needed. So just to give you, we don't have exact estimates. There's sort of varying estimates of how big the gig economy is. Gartner suggests that, today the gig economy and contingent workers, that's important, constitutes 15 to 25% of the global workforce. The Fair Work Foundation estimates that there are about 50 million gig workers around the world. And MasterCard expects that the gig economy is projected to grow to 455 billion by year end 2023 in gross volume transactions. Trying to go down to the next slide. Okay, there we go. What's another assumption that underlies the discussion and the global discourse on digital work? Well, the other assumption is that people entering the gig economy in the global south in particular, again, this was the region that the study focused on. We had 3 countries from Africa and 3 from Asia, that the people entering the gig economy in the global south are already in precarious jobs. So gig economy work, even if there is this oversupply of labor and depressing of working conditions, is really no worse than what already exists and is perhaps a step up. While that may in fact be true, there is evidence that also suggests that even in informal work, people in informal work engage in gig work to either supplement their income or sometimes they actually move out of formal work entirely because gig work offers more flexibility and has lower barriers to entry. So this idea that workers are already in the informal economy and those are the workers that are entering these somewhat precarious gig work scenarios is not necessarily well substantiated. In fact, a 2016 study by Prakarsa and the JustJobs Network examined on-demand transport workers in Jakarta, Indonesia. We interviewed about 205 motorbike taxi drivers from Gojek and Grab Bike. And we found that many of these 205 workers that we interviewed, the prospect of a higher income and looking for a bigger pool of passengers prompted them to come online. Factors like increased flexibility in terms of hours. Excuse me, Delhi pollution. You'll have to give me a pass. Increased flexibility in terms of working hours, dissatisfaction with their previous job, as well as unemployment, were all factors that sort of propelled people to enter this online gig economy. But what is the most interesting fact out of that study is that 51% of those that we interviewed that were previously employed actually came from the formal economy. So this is just to say that when we're thinking about labor regimes for workers, we actually don't yet even know enough about what the trajectories are. Where do they come from and where are they going in order to be able to assess what the appropriate regulatory frameworks are? And so this study in particular was a step in that direction, but of course there's a lot more work to be done in that regard. What is the third assumption? We often hear that gig work offers more and better opportunities for women. And again, this is an important factor to consider when we're talking about labor regimes, because we really need to understand, how gig work is different and what are the gendered impacts of gig work. And the truth is that we might think that gig work offers more and better opportunities for women. And again, under certain circumstances, that may be true. Of course, gig work gives women the opportunity to balance income generation with domestic responsibilities. But women don't have access to technology or skills or even equal access to the same range of opportunities in the gig economy that men do. And so in some ways, this kind of work also comes with its own disequilibrating effects and inequality effects, as it were. And of course, when I say they don't have equal access to the same range of opportunities in the gig economy, we know that, for example, some of the transportation apps disproportionately employ men, and this is equally because women may not feel safe in those kinds of jobs. And in some sense, this assumption that gig work, because it offers this enhanced flexibility to balance domestic responsibilities and income generation, is a good thing for women, maybe, but we also need to think about the fact that it can sometimes reinforce patriarchy and gender biases behind the guise of flexibility, keeping women at home and keeping them from going out into the workplace because of safety reasons or exploitation. And so, we need to think in a more nuanced way also about the policy frameworks and the labor regimes that provide equal opportunity and equality of outcomes as this new form of work emerges. So this study in particular looked at the specific characteristics of digital work. And one of course, the major changes in how this new emerging ecosystem of digital work is upending existing employment models is that it takes the employee-employer relationship from a bilateral framework to one that is now a trilateral employment relationship between the worker, the consumer, as well as the technology intermediary. And what defines the relationship between platforms and workers is, to some extent, the degree of autonomy and control that they exercise. So one of the major sort of opaque areas in looking at appropriate labor regimes for gig workers is the fact that when we move from a bilateral to a trilateral employment relationship, it's not clear what the definitions are anymore. Are technology intermediaries really employers? Are service providers workers? Are they workers that are subject to the consumers and accountable to the consumers, or are they accountable to these technology intermediaries? And those questions are really fundamental in terms of answering who is responsible for ensuring protections, social protections, who is responsible for bearing the cost of the provision of these kinds of welfare benefits. And so that becomes very fundamental, not just from a rights-based perspective, but also from an economic perspective, because we want workers, we want to harness the productive potential of workers, particularly for a segment of the economy that's growing exponentially as gig work is. And in this relationship between platforms and workers, the degree of autonomy to some extent over a number of factors and working conditions is fundamental to, I think, delineating the relationship between the employer and between the platform and the worker. So what do I mean by that? Do workers, what degree of control do workers have over setting prices? Do they have autonomy over deciding what kind of work they want to accept or not accept? Do they have oversight and control over how many hours they work or how much time they spend on a particular platform? How can they be excluded off the platform, or is it equal opportunity and everyone can participate? And to what extent can the technology intermediary exclude people? And the restriction of trade. Can a service provider who's who's technically a self-employed individual and a contractor, can they decide how many jobs they want to take or how many different platforms they want to work for? Or are there some restrictions that are placed on them? And so all of these kinds of factors determine the sort of parameters of the relationship between a platform and a worker that essentially then sort of point toward whether or not and who should and how much responsibility should platforms, governments, and workers take for providing appropriate protections. What do I mean by appropriate protections? So when we talk about labor regimes, there's social protection, which is, of course, Social Security. So basic Social Security, referring to health insurance or schemes transfers that provide access to health care, disability pensions, maternity, and so on. Also active labor and problems. Such as job search assistance and training or other types of investments in building human capital. And then there's a whole bunch of regulations around labor regulations, like access to collective bargaining and freedom of association, notice periods, working hours, leave, health and safety, minimum wages. And then there's the extent to which these different labor regulations are enforced and enforceable in the gig economy. In all of these questions, there's a lot more detail in the report. Just very quickly, 2 more slides. I'm not going to go through this, but just to give you an idea, in the report, what we've actually done is gone through the types of labor regimes that I just talked about and looked at our 6 case countries and mapped out in quite a bit of detail what currently exists by way of protections for workers. And then we talk about how, well, this is what exists and how can you improve on that given the characteristics of the gig economy and this new emerging ecosystem of digital work. And one of the key findings that I leave you with, and then I hand it back over to Albert to go over the recommendations, is that though the study talks about labor regimes and focuses in on labor regimes, that is not alone enough. there are a number of different kinds of regulatory policies and domains that need to be considered when we talk about creating an ecosystem of work that provides equality of opportunity and equality of outcome, and that also harnesses the productive potential of this large and growing gig economy workforce. And those types of regulatory domain, as you can see, range from labor to tax to competition to how do you balance innovation with these other kinds of regulations, social security, data governance, education and skills, and so on. So with that, I give it back to Albert to take us through the final recommendations in the study. And just to say that this is just a teaser, there's a lot of detail in the report. So please do go and take a look at it. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Sabina.
Sorry, Albert, without interrupting you, perhaps you can speed up a little bit because you have already used 25 minutes, so that we stay a little bit in the program.
Yes, I'll be very brief. So as Sabina alluded to, that there's quite a significant amount of work that was done on the recommendations. And I'm not going to talk through all of them now, but what I want to leave you with is a set of principles that we distilled for regulating gig work in the digital economy. So the case studies that we looked at in the study vary quite a bit in terms of the absorption of technologies in the economies, and the higher the digital adoption, the more motivated governments are to invest in policies and regulations to help their populations or the gig workers leverage the benefits of digital transformation. Also, the more relevant the policy questions are. So the principles for regulating the work in the gig economy, we articulated 4 specifically. So firstly, policymakers need to follow a tiered approach that calibrates the level of market development and existing public interest. So in countries where the platform work constitutes a smaller and a portion of total national work, the focus should really be on trying to grow the platform economy and the gig work economy. And as that growth occurs, then the policy focus needs to shift with that. In this study, we broke out, or we categorized our countries into 3 tiers to illustrate this approach. Secondly, we need to differentiate between location-based work and cloud-based work because of the different legal entities that are involved in that, and also the physical presence of the work in location-based work compared to cloud-based gig work. Thirdly, policymakers needs to migrate from more traditional supervisory tools to digital supervisory tools. The gig economy is mostly based in the digital space, which means that the policymakers and regulators needs to improve the tools that they use so that they can understand how decisions are made in the digital world. And that often requires a significant amount of data analysis and data understanding skills. And then lastly, a balance needs to be found between national agency with regional and global cooperation. Governments must strike a balance between national regulation, where they're able to enforce it, and a reliance on global cooperation where national enforcement can be counterproductive or ineffective, particularly because some of these large platforms that provide gig work are not domiciled in the national countries. Thank you, Georg.
Thank you very much, Albert and Sabina, for this excellent presentation. And as already indicated by Sabina, that gives only an overview. And I really recommend to all the participants to have a close look at the study. It's about 25 pages. It's a very rich document and it's really worthwhile reading it. We now come to the second presentation on the Fair Work Foundation. The study of Cenfri and the JustJobs Network is focusing on regulation by the government, so by the public regulator. The approach of the Fair Work Foundation is a different one, and that's a very interesting complement. The Fair Work Foundation is rating digital platforms and according to certain criteria, and thus giving an incentive to digital platforms to improve the situation of platform workers. So I will now hand over to Srujana. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks for that. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my presentation?
You see your screen, not your presentation.
Oh, okay, 1 second. Sorry, I'm not sure what's happening. Give me 1 second. I'm seeming to not be able to share the specific program. Not entirely sure how to.
Look, can you help?
Yes. If you just want to send me your presentation, in the meantime, I will upload it then.
Yeah, it's just a Google Slides presentation, so it would be good if you could present and I could talk in the meanwhile. Is that okay?
That is okay.
Okay. Should I paste it in the chat or?
Yes, please. This would be great.
Perhaps you could already start while Luke is uploading the presentation.
Yes, let me do that.
If possible.
I can do that. Sorry for the trouble. Good morning to everybody on the call. Thanks for having me here today. On behalf of the Fair Work Project, I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk at this forum. My name is Srujana Katta. I'm a doctoral researcher and I work at the Fair Work Research Project, which is based at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford. I've been asked to tell you a little bit about the Fair Work Project's methods and aims today, so that's what I'll do. Thanks for presenting the presentation. Sorry that I wasn't able to because of technical issues. Just to begin, so my colleagues at the project have been researching working conditions into the global gig economy over the past several years. So this research has formed the basis of the Fair Work Action Research Project. And today I'll spend some time telling you about that. Before I start, I wanted to say thank you to Albert and Sabina for the excellent presentation, and the report seems to cover a lot of ground, so I'm looking forward to digging into it later. And my presentation might be a tad bit repetitive because I also go over some of the definitions and the size of the gig economy, so I'll try and go quickly over those bits so we can keep to time. So Luke, if you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So by the gig economy or the platform economy, what I'm referring to is the economic transactions that are happening through, via, and on digital platforms. And we can distinguish between two types of digital platforms. So one where people are enabled to sell commodities like Airbnb or eBay, and another type, which we call digital labor platforms, which where people can sell their services or their labor. So at the Fair Work project, we're concerned with the second type of digital labor platform. And examples for this type of platform include Uber, Deliveroo, Amazon Mechanical Turk, and so on. So then among digital labor platforms, there's another two categories. So there's the cloud work platforms. Sabina has already mentioned this, so I'm trying to keep this short. There's the first type is cloud work platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk, Upwork, and so on, where the work can in theory be done from anywhere as long as you have a stable internet connection. And then the second time is geographically tethered platforms like Uber, Deliveroo, Helpling, Ola, and so on, where the work has to be done in a specific location. Luke, could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So the gig economy is very big and it's growing. And as Sabina has already mentioned, nobody really knows how big exactly the gig economy is, as there are many methodological issues with measuring the size of the gig economy across different sectors and contexts. Some recent estimates say that there's around 3 million adults, more than 3 million adults in the UK who perform work in the gig economy. There's more than 8 million adults in Germany. And it's vastly magnified, this figure, when we look at other contexts. Estimates range from a few tens of millions of workers to more than 200 people around the world. Our own Fair Work project's conservative estimate is on the lower range is around 50 million workers, but then the upper range goes into several hundreds of millions of workers around the world. In the Global South, Richard Heeks, one of our collaborators, has estimated there's around 90 million people who work in the gig economy. So beyond the size of the gig economy at the current moment, the scale of such gig-based labor transactions is also very rapidly expanding. It's predicted that by 2025, one third of all labor transactions will happen via digital platforms. So I just want to underscore what Sabina was saying in the previous presentation, that this isn't, even if it is a small part of the economy at the current time, it is something that is growing exponentially, and regulating it is of crucial importance, increasingly so. So the way that the model works in the gig economy across most contexts is that instead of an employment relationship, the digital platform presents itself as a simple intermediary between consumers and workers. So in this way, they don't employ the workers, but they treat the workers essentially as a small independent business. In some cases, the classification of workers as independent contractors or self-employed workers is genuine, according to the law of that jurisdiction. But in other cases, there is a case of misclassification. This is a very contentious issue, as you all probably already know, with debates on clarifying employment classification rules or on creating third categories of workers happening across many contexts, most recently with the high-profile Proposition 22 of California. Irrespective of whether worker classification in the gig economy is legitimate or not according to the laws, the point that we focus on is that gig workers are not protected by many of the rights that they would have if they were classified as employees. So my colleagues at Fair Work have done lots of research, as I've mentioned, across contexts into the gig economy, across Africa, Asia, and Europe. We've interviewed many hundreds of workers in countries like Vietnam, the Philippines, India, South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, Kenya, Uganda, and most recently Germany and the UK as well. And in the course of that research, what we found is that there are a lot of benefits that accrue to platform workers. So most obviously, they have jobs and incomes that perhaps they wouldn't have had otherwise. But also many workers report that they really enjoy the flexibility that gig work affords them, and they also perceive that they're more objectively managed than in other types of work. But we also found that workers face a range of issues. Lots of workers fall through the cracks, and when they do, because they aren't employees, they're rarely protected by local labor law, and then they face issues because of that. So I'm going to list a few issues that we've come across in our research. By definition, gig work is precarious and it's insecure because the certainty of getting more work is not guaranteed. It's often unsafe. This is especially clear in the course of the past year. Over the pandemic, sorry, I'll let you know when to change to the next slide. Over the course of the pandemic, it's become quite clear that a lot of gig workers provide essential services for us to keep our societies running, but they often do so in quite unsafe conditions. In a lot of cases, there's also an oversupply of labor power, which leads to some vulnerability. There's low pay, especially when we account for the time spent on the job, as well as the costs that workers have to usually incur because they're independent businesses, so they don't get compensated for any costs that they incur on the jobs. So accounting for these issues, sometimes the pay that they take home falls below minimum wages. And some workers experience explicit discrimination, some workers experience wage theft. There's a lack of accountability for platforms. So workers can, for instance, be fired, or often the language that's used is deactivated without any due process. And finally, there's an inability to collectively organize or bargain collectively. So these are some of the issues that we've come across in our research. Could we go to the next slide, please? And these are the starting conditions that led to the foundation of the Fair Work project. The point of our project is to sidestep the discussion about employment classification and acknowledge that irrespective of how a worker is classified, platform companies do have significant control over the conditions that workers face. And because they have that control over working conditions, we believe that we can encourage them to improve those conditions. Could we go to the next slide, please? So essentially what we did was we set out to do 4 key things. First of all, we wanted to co-develop a set of fair work principles for the platform economy with the people and the organizations that they impact on, which is gig workers themselves and platforms as well. Secondly, we wanted to carry out research to evaluate digital platforms across different contexts against those principles. Then we wanted to use that research to give every major platform a fairness rating or a fair work score out of 10. Then we want to use that score as a pressure point to encourage fair work and discourage unfair work. I'll go into detail into all of these in just a second. Ultimately, the aim of our project is to understand and counter some of the forces that disempower gig workers around the world. We've piloted all this in a few different contexts. We started out in India and South Africa in 2019. And this year, we've additionally worked in Germany, the UK, Indonesia, Chile, and Ecuador. Alongside rating geographically tethered platforms, we're also researching working conditions at cloud work platforms to produce a global set of cloud work scores. Could we go to the next slide, please? So our first task then when we started was essentially to determine what we mean by fair work. What we wanted to do was ensure that the principles that we use emerge from a genuine process of dialogue with key stakeholders. So my colleagues took a summary of existing labor standards from other contexts to some meetings that we co-organized with the International Labour Organization, ILO, and UNCTAD in Geneva, where we brought together workers, platforms, unions, and academics to talk about the ways of setting fairness standards for the gig economy. And out of those meetings came a list of 5 fair work principles for the platform economy. Next slide, please. So this is a lot of text, and I don't expect you to read all of it. It's all on our website, but just to kind of go over the spirit of the 5 principles. The first of it is fair pay, where we basically say that workers should be paid at least a minimum wage, accounting for costs and their active time in the worker's jurisdiction. The second is fair conditions, where we say that workers' health and well-being should be protected, and any sort of risks that they encounter in the course of work should be protected from those risks. The third principle is fair contracts, where we think that at the minimum national law should be followed. There should be a clear contract, and as far as possible, there shouldn't be any terms that are unfair towards workers and should not engage in misclassification if possible. The fourth one is fair management, which means having an appeals process for disciplinary procedures and policies that ensure equality in the ways that workers are managed. And the fifth principle is fair representation. This means having a process through which worker voice can be expressed and recognizing collective bodies like unions where they do exist. Like I said, our website contains the detail of these principles, so do go and explore if you have some time. I've described the kind of top line spirit of each principle, but they break down into quite specific criteria that platforms need to meet in order to be awarded the corresponding points. And we have two sets of principles for geographically tethered platforms and for cloud work platforms. Could we go to the next slide, please? So our principles are not set in stone. We gradually evolve them on an annual basis as worker circumstances evolve and as we learn more in dialogue with workers, unions, platforms, and other stakeholders. So this graphic basically depicts how our annual principles change. We use various stakeholder consultations, and our yearly fieldwork feeds into changes to principles that we vote on across all of the different fair work teams in all of our project countries. And in that way, we continuously evolve the 5 core principles that we think should apply universally to platform work, but then that are applied quite differently in different contexts. Could we go to the next slide, please? So now with the 5 principles, we basically then developed ways of assessing platforms against these 5 principles, with the purpose of giving each platform a score out of 10. In each of our pilot countries, we work with local researchers, workers, and others to work out locally applicable thresholds that would translate these universal 5 principles to the context in a way that makes sense. A detailed methodology as well is available on our website if you're interested in knowing more. For each of the principles, platforms can get 1 basic point, and then if they get that basic point, then they can get an advanced point. And so across the 5 principles, platforms can potentially be awarded a total of 10 points. Could we go to the next slide, please? So with these principles and the scoring system in place, we then moved on to the second objective, which was to research working conditions at different platforms. The way we do this is to collect data through triangulation of methods. We conduct worker interviews so in any given context, we kind of identify 10 to 15 major digital platforms operating in that space. And we conduct interviews of workers who work for those platforms. We conduct desk research into any outstanding court cases, any outstanding sort of employment issues relating to working for that platform. And then we also conduct interviews with platform managers. And in order to allow ourselves the ability to score platforms that don't want to participate, we decided that we're only going to stand behind the evidence of positive points rather than negative ones. So what that means essentially is that all platforms start at a default of 0 points. And then when we have evidence to show that they meet various criteria, then we give them a point. Then for each countries where we produce the scores, we enlist the help of some colleagues from our other project countries. So like I said, we operate in almost between 15 and 20 countries right now, and we're expanding as well, so that number is a bit uncertain. So we enlist the help of some colleagues from all of these different project countries to enable a peer review of the scoring to ensure that there's some uniformity in how the principles are applied across different contexts. Could we go to the next slide, please? So by collecting data in this way about all large platforms operating in our pilot countries, we basically then assign every one of those platforms a score and a scorecard. This, what you see here, is an example scorecard for Clever Shuttle, which is a German transportation platform. This was their score in 2020. And then we put each of these scorecards as well as the scores on our website, and then we publicize them. Could we go to the next slide, please? And then we create what we call a league table for each country so that people are able to compare the scores across different platforms. So what you see here is our 2019 league tables for South Africa and India. And then if you go to the next slide, you will see our 2020 league tables for South Africa and Germany. Our India report will be coming out shortly as well. And soon we'll also have a cloud work report in the works where we'll have a global cloud work league table. So can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Then we've also seen some of the best scoring platforms use our logo and the score that we give them on their own websites and apps to indicate that they provide fair working conditions to their workers. So here you see examples from Flipkart in India and a platform called No Sweat in South Africa, where they've used our branding on their website. Could we go to the next slide, please? So we see that this project can have potential impacts on different types of actors. First of all, with platforms directly, we envision both short and long-term impacts. In the short term, we've already seen quite a few platforms being willing to engage with us directly and agree to make concrete changes in order to score better. And in the long term, our hope is that we can the pressure that we create will keep driving some of the change that we're looking to achieve, which is basically to create more of a penalty for unfair work. As next steps, we'd also like to do a few other things with the other key actors that we interface with. With workers and with organized labor, we want the Fair Work scores to serve as a sort of benchmark that they can then use in their own negotiations with platforms and with advocacy around regulation. So in much the same way that the Living Wage Foundation's calculations are now used as benchmarks that unions in the UK strive towards in the negotiations with employers, we also want the Fair Work criteria and the Fair Work scores to be used by workers and unions. Then additionally, with regulators, the Fair Work criteria provide a sort of minimum understanding of rights that workers should be having in the platform economy. And we've been working with ILO's Future of Work Commission and labor lawyers and regulators in a few different contexts, including South Africa, India, and Germany, to try to institutionally formalize the Fair Work principles into regulation. And then finally, with end users and consumers, currently we're working on an institutionalization plan where we're trying to be in touch with large buyers like governments, universities, consumer organizations, to try to get them to commit to only working with the platforms that score well. Could we go to the next slide, please?
Srujana, I'm really sorry for disturbing, but
I'm almost done.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Because we have to save a little bit of time for our discussion.
Definitely, I'm almost done.
Thank you.
So these are just some of the impacts that we've already had, where different platforms have agreed to make changes to their platforms, such as committing to developing a workers' organization, to making sure that workers all earn above the minimum wage, to improving grievance policies, to instituting policies on non-discrimination, living wage policy, and so on. Could we go to the next slide, please? So just to summarize, I wanted to say a few more comments. We do know that the digital revolution is undoubtedly changing the landscape of work around the world, and we really need to ensure that the jobs that are being created are good and decent jobs. So part of how we will get there will be to use research to not just understand platforms and how they work, but to use that research to make working conditions in the gig economy more visible in a reproducible and directly comparable manner. The pandemic has made especially clear to all of us how essential gig workers are. They're frontline key workers across many industries and contexts, while at the same time, they face inadequate employment and welfare protections. So I want to end here with a few comments about regulating the gig economy. Labor laws were enacted over a century ago across the world in light of the unequal relationship of exchange between companies and workers. So while the world of work has changed since, the fundamental reasons for the existence of labor protections is unchanged: to ensure safe and healthy workplaces, to give workers a voice, and to provide minimum protections with respect to working time and earnings. There's no reason that workers who find work through the gig economy should not also have minimum protections like in other work. However, there is a debate on this, which is also the reason we are all here today, which perhaps stems from the novelty of the way that gig economy work is organized using recent innovations in workplace technologies. But work in the gig economy continues to be work. As I described, our research shows that it's part of a larger trend in casualization, and workers face many issues relating to precarization and work insecurity. Platforms exert substantial control over the prices of the services that they mediate, the terms and conditions of these services. They use incentives to control workers' schedules and behaviors. They use rating systems as part of a system of direction and discipline to manage workers in the course of their work. This issue, which is the extent to which workers are their own bosses or whether they're being managed as by an employer by platforms, is increasingly being taken up in courts around the world, where the claim that gig workers are their own bosses is coming under scrutiny and courts are disagreeing with this characterization. Authorities are stepping in across contexts to recognize that workers should not be denied protection simply because they work for platforms. There's numerous examples, but we can go into that maybe in the discussion. Moreover, platform technologies are extending.
Jana, I think you have to wrap up, otherwise there will be no discussion. I'm really sorry. It's
totally okay. I have one more sentence. Should I finish it?
Okay.
Okay.
One more sentence.
One more sentence. Platform technologies are extending into more and more sectors. So the real question becomes how to regulate. The same technology that's allowing parceling and distributing work to gig workers, which can also be used to monitor when workers are working, when they're searching for work, where they are located. So that can also be used to ensure the same minimum protections that to be put into place. So perhaps regulation is a longer term approach, but our project is trying to use shorter term media and consumer pressure to incentivize fair work. I'll end there.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rujana, and sorry for mispronouncing your name in the beginning.
That's okay.
Now we have a very complete picture, whereas the study of Cenfri and the JustJobs Network was focusing on regulation by governments, on what the public regulator can do. The approach of the Fair Work Foundation is a different one, exerting public pressure on digital platforms and nudging them to take their corporate social responsibility serious. We now have in the call two representatives from digital platforms, and the one is Ora Boboyo from the platform Joberman in Nigeria. The other is Madhuranat from the platform Ola in India. Ora is currently the Chief Operating Officer of Joberman in Nigeria, and Madhu has been the head of sales and the head of strategy and operations of Ola in India. I think, unfortunately, first of all, welcome to our discussion. And unfortunately, we have to cut back our panel discussion to 10 minutes. And for an introduction, I would like to ask you to briefly present your platform. How does it work? What is your business model? And how are you earning money as a digital platform? Perhaps, or you would like to start?
Oh, yes, I will. Can you hear me?
Yes, very good.
Good. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. So just a quick introduction on what Joberman is. So Joberman is a recruitment platform. What we do in Joberman is to leverage technology and data-driven recruitment solution to work with employers to make sure that they have the right people in the right jobs. So pretty much what we do is to form that digital bridge between employers and job seekers. We pretty much call ourselves the marketplace for jobs in Nigeria. And what we put out there to employers is one, access to a large pool of candidates. Of course, we collect enough data from the candidates to ensure that employers are able to make proper decisions during their recruitment process. And of course, we also help with the recruitment process when needed. and we also have connections into the international community, depending on the need of the employer. How do we make money? Well, we make money via through the employers, not the job seekers at all. So the job seekers come on our platform, put in their profile, and then the employers reach out to us for depending on the brief of their role. They reach out to us, and then we charge the employers based off the kind of access they want, and then we supply all the information they need to be able to link up with the job seekers. The job seekers then apply to those jobs, and then the employers make decisions based on that. So our business model is employer focused, and we make money off the employers. That's pretty much a summary of what JobOman does. I hope that covers it.
Yes, that covers it very nicely. And if I understand you right, you are not gig work platform. You digital job fair, a kind of matching platform, bringing together employers and job seekers.
Exactly. Yes,
that's right. Okay, then we will pass to Madhu and the platform Ola in India, which is, according to what I've seen in the internet, a ride-hailing and food delivery service platform.
Hello, Judge. Thank you for this opportunity. I used to work at Ola as the head of the supply and the strategy. So there, my whole role was very connected with what happens on the supply side of business, which is the service provider side of the business. So I used to work on projects, or I used to head the strategic projects related to drivers as well as the vehicles. Ola, as you said, is a ride-hailing platform in India. It's a homegrown platform. It is created in India, and it's currently more of a group rather than just a single platform. Ola also operates in other businesses like food delivery, which was from an acquisition, and financial services. They also have another company which operates as a leasing company, which provides vehicles for gig workers who would like to work on a gig basis. So Ola is currently, and its current major focus is actually the Ola electric vehicle, which is which has some ambitious goals to change the way transport happens in India. So that's about what Ola does. Its main strength comes from its wide presence. It operates in more than 100 cities and towns in India, and it employs around 20 million drivers, and it more than employs, I should say, it provides a platform for 20 million drivers, and it does close to 1.5 million rides a day before the pandemic started. And now I'm sure it would have dropped significantly because of the lack of consumer demand. But in its heyday, Ola has been forced to reckon with an ambitious goal of providing mobility for 1 billion Indians. So that's about Ola.
Thanks, Madhu. What requirements must workers meet in order to be registered on your platform and to be able to use it? And what regulations apply to the platform workers with regard to pay, working hours, and working conditions?
Sure. So, like other major ride-hailing platforms, the basic requirement here in Ola would be having a valid driving license, and proof of identification, proof of address, and most of these documents are fairly commonly available, except in the case of the migrant workers who move in from the rural or the far-off regions. And then Ola operates, has its own processes to ensure that it meets the current requirements in the regulatory environment regarding the identity of the personnel that operate on its platform. as well as the consumers. So a basic know your customer as well as a know your service provider requirements are met by Ola. And when it comes to pay, like most digital platforms in this space, it's been operating in a dynamic way where it tries to match the supply with the demand. And unlike most other domains where supply and demand are fairly stable over a duration of time, in this case, at a very smaller size of location, right, like a small locality, a small block, the demand and supply keeps varying. So both the consumers as well as the service providers keep seeing a constant fluctuation in the price that they get, either for the services or they pay for the services that they avail. And this range is fairly wide. It can be as less as 0.5 of a stipulated wage or a stipulated price to sometimes 2.5 or 3 times the normal prices. So that's the kind of dynamism that is there, and most of this dynamism is fairly technologically mediated. There are no specific preferences or benefits provided to a smaller set of consumers or a smaller set of service providers. These are fairly technologically mediated and typically democratic, as long as they both the consumers as well as the service providers adhere to a fair practice and a goodness-based usage of the platform, and there are no other negative behaviors that are exhibited by either of them.
Thanks a lot, Madhu. Coming back to Joberman in Nigeria, you are advertising job vacancies of enterprises on your platform, and the enterprises are paying for it. Do you screen these job vacancies before putting them on your platform? Let's say with respect to the respect of certain standards.
Yes. So part of the sign-up process for any employer, which we really take very seriously internally for Joberman, is to actually do a background check at the time you're signing up as an employer. So first of all, we check with the government agencies to know if you are a registered employer. Then we also look out for your digital footprint and look out for reviews, public reviews about your company, about the working conditions in your company, if there has been any form of scandal, out there about the company. Then we also check for the certificate of the certificate to practice in whatever sector or industry they practice. And these are all of the things that we look into before we approve any employer on our platform. Now, even after that, each of the job listings posted on our platform goes through a verification process, meaning that the moment you post your job, it does not go live immediately. There's an approval process internally because we also want to be sure that the listing condition, the job condition, meets the requirements to be able to work properly at that space. So yeah.
Thanks a lot. Perhaps last question to Madhu. We have seen on the presentation of Srujana that Ola has been rated by the Fair Work Foundation in 2019. Let's say, what do you think of the approach of the Fair Work Foundation, and is an incentive for Ola to develop its business procedures, especially, let's say, the negotiations with platform partners?
So I'm not really very clear on what were the exact data points that were used for rating, though the principles of rating were fairly obvious, and I really agree with the principles laid out by Fair Work Foundation on what is the premise or the basis on which the gig worker economy has to be built to ensure a favorable working environment for the gig workers. All the principles are very sound. And to some extent, I was a bit surprised by the rating on Ola because Ola has actually put in place certain practices which were kind of revolutionary when they started. For example, they provide insurance for the drivers, right? And it's a very, very nominally priced insurance that is very much affordable. So it covers any financial risks that they experience while operating on the platform. It also provides fair wages, and the billing or whatever the earnings are there, it's fairly transparent. And the share of earnings that is taken from the overall billing is also nominal. And it also encourages so one thing which I would really like to bring out at this point is like I was the head of strategic projects for supply, and I have seen broadly there are different categories of service providers, and a smaller base of service providers who actually provide the maximum volume of services are actually very hardworking. On an average, they work for 17 hours a day. And while they do that, it's not because of an enforcement, but it's simply because of their economic opportunity. These are very driven and ambitious people. For whatever reasons, there are multiple reasons they come on board this platform, not just Ola, but it could be any platform. But they work really hard to ensure that they get a lot more rights and earn a lot more. So in that aspect, working hours is not really a true measure of the fairness of the platform or the gig working. It's more to do with the individual aspirations and the ambitions of the working of the service providers.
Thank you very much, Madhu. Unfortunately, we have to stop here with our panel discussions. I have a lot of other questions, but just to give a chance to the other participants for their questions, we will open up now the Q&A session. Unfortunately, we are nearly at the end of our time. That is, of course, not the fault of the presenters, but the fault of the moderator, who has done a very bad job in timekeeping. So I propose to extend a little bit by 10 minutes for those who are still available. And yes, I'm looking forward to your questions and contributions. You could put them in the chat, and Luke will screen the chat and forward your questions and contributions to the audience.
Perfect. Thank you, Georg. A first question that came up from Sabina and is directed at Madhu. It's a question if Ola did provide incentives related to hours of work.
So I would say it was provided based on the number of trips or the number of rides taken or provided by the service providers. So it does not directly translate to number of hours of work. It translates more to the economic opportunity taken by the service providers. So if they take, say, 5 rides, which would actually translate to just 3 hours of work, so it's more to do with the incentives. So where there was a limitation or there was an enforcement of hours of work was with respect to the service providers who were operating with the Ola Fleet Technologies. So the Ola Fleet Technologies is a separate company under the Ola Group, where the fleet is actually owned by the company, and the workers who work there are similar to employees, though they work on a contract basis. So there is a enforcement of number of hours of work, like a minimum 11 hours a day is enforced.
Okay, great, thank you. I'm going forward quickly. The next question is from Chris Chetty from the HSRC. And his question is formed generally, like, do you believe the platforms like Ola and crowd-based platforms are creating new jobs or causing greater employment informality in the global south?
Honestly, it is creating both.
Perhaps we could forward these questions also to Albert, Sabina, and Srujana.
Sure.
But Madhu, you can start, of course. Sorry for interrupting you.
Sure. So Krish, basically it is doing both. There are new jobs getting created, but it's also introducing greater employment informality, wherein the barriers to employment have been reduced to new lows, so that more people who were in different sectors or even the formal sector are more attracted to the informal sector because of the flexibility of working hours and the earning and whatever their other constraints are.
Albert and Sabina, what is your view on this question?
So I'll answer first. So it's from the data that I've looked at, it's very hard to see necessarily where people come from. But in terms of opportunities, that I have to agree with what Madhu said, is that the barrier to entry is the lowest that there's been, and also in terms of the pay that people can get in the gig economy, it's often quite a lot better than the informal economy alternatives.
Sabina?
Yes, thank you, Georg. The study that I cited from Prakarsad and JustJobs Network that we did in Indonesia was in response to exactly this question. I agree with Albert that we actually don't know enough about the trajectories of people. So the movement between informal and formal is clear. So that's one point that I wanted to make. And like I said, 51% of the 205 or so people that we interviewed in Indonesia, 51% that were working previously actually came from the formal formal work into informal work. So but that's one study, and it's hard to know what the exact trajectories are. And the other thing to keep in mind is that even when it comes to formal work, overall there's a global shift toward precarity. So you can be in informal or formal work, but not have a written contract, not have Social Security. And so, overall, globally, there's a trend toward precariousness, and how we situate this discourse on the economy within that context is something that we need to be nuanced about.
Thank you. Srujana?
I don't really have much more to add than what Sabina and Albert have just said, so perhaps we should move to the next question.
Okay. If there is a next question.
Yes, there are actually a few. There is one that goes quite in the direction that Sabina already asked. I'm not sure in what respect it may has been answered already, but there was another question to Madhu. Like the recent regulation announced by the Indian government makes platforms take responsibilities to make sure workers do not exceed hours and restrict the commission and surge pricing. How does this affect workers now?
This will definitely impact the workers who are already very hardworking and who are aspirational, because I have seen a lot of drivers who started with a rental car and then owned a fleet of 5 cars by themselves. So such people who have the aspiration will definitely feel the pinch. But overall, I would look at this regulation, which I think was enforced just yesterday, as more of guardrails to ensure that fairness is established for those like the Ola fleet workers that I was mentioning, do not get stretched too much. But ultimately, it's up to the individuals as to what are the other options if they do not want to do this work, which stretches them 12 hours a day. What are the other economic opportunities for them to earn the same money? So it's an individual choice.
Okay. Thanks. Yes, we have two more questions. First one comes, in the report of Cenfri and JustJobs, it apparently was shown that there are several writing and translation services of gig workers in Kenya for the global north. First question there would be, to what extent do you think does this facilitate a knowledge transfer from the global north to Kenyan gig workers?
So, once again, I'll answer first, and then Sabina, you can come in. What we see happening in Kenya is that it's often students in the US, Canada, and in Europe that outsources their essay writing to workers in Kenya, and as I said during the presentation, one of the main reasons for that is the high level standard of English in Kenya. I'm not sure about knowledge transfer, but I think it does show that Kenya has a certain competitive advantage, and because it is not a location-based service, they can gain market share in that space. And that is one of the things that I find personally very interesting about the whole cloud work gig economy, is that all of a sudden you are competing in a global labor market, and not just you're not just competing against people in the same country as you.
This is really one of my favorite questions, because I am really interested in the issue of the knowledge economy, because a lot of the countries in the global south are sort of hinging their hopes on an evolving a knowledge economy. My short answer to this is that I will say that most likely this kind of translation services and transcription services are not translating into a knowledge transfer that would lead to higher value-added activities, and that's partly because also the education and skill levels to actually take this information and actually translate it into higher value activities, higher value add activities, isn't necessarily there, which really makes the case for investments in human capital on the part of developing economies. So just to quickly say, India, for example, saw this IT boom, and we hear about it all the time. But when you actually look at sort of the human capital accumulation in the country, it's still really quite low. So you might be able to create jobs out of some of these low-end services using technology, but does that translate into any kind of longer-term knowledge transfer that leads to higher value-added, more innovative, more analytical type of activities? Not necessarily. And I'm really happy, Oscar, to engage with you on this issue in much more detail offline, because I'm very interested in this particular issue. Thank you.
Perfect.
From my side, with respect to this question, I have put in the chat a study of the German Development Institute on digital jobs, African jobs in the digital era. A large part of this study is on online work in Kenya, and you might find at least some indications with respect to your two questions in this study.
Perfect, thanks. Looking at the time, we have two more questions. I think one was from Srujana for Madhu. As you are both panelists, maybe you could quickly then connect yourself. And one question was, which is quite easily and rapidly answered, was a question from about if there are any figures or estimates on how the COVID pandemic has affected and could continue to affect the number of people using digital labor platforms. So maybe I know from the working group there has been some some presentations on numbers. I don't know, Albert, if you had something ready or any other panelists, we can maybe share it afterwards in the chat or via email to the participants.
There have been 2 reports from the Fair Work Foundation. Perhaps through Jana, you could elaborate a little bit on it.
Perfect.
Sure. So I think, with respect to figures or estimates on how the COVID pandemic has affected the number of people using platforms, we've had sort of indications that this has expanded. However, it's hard to pinpoint any numerical estimates. We do have 2 reports that we've released in the past year that track the policies that different digital platforms have taken with respect to protecting workers from some of the risks that the pandemic has caused for them. So I'm happy to share these after the call as well. But I think from anecdotal evidence, especially with respect to cloud work platforms, what we found is that there's a lot of people now turning to cloud work platforms to supplement their income, that either supplement their income or to make up for lost income if they've lost jobs in other work that they're doing. But it's hard to pin down specific numerical estimates. I hope that's helpful. With respect to the other question, so thank you, Madhu, for saying that you agree with the principles and like this is something that we can then use to regulate platform work in India in some ways. So I think my question was just because you had mentioned about how workers sometimes work 17 hours a day or more, and that has to do with how self-driven they are and sort of work ethic. And I was trying to understand if you think that it has something also potentially, in some cases at least, to do with some of the incentives that cause people to work such long hours a day. That often causes exhaustion and perhaps unsafe working conditions as well if you're driving for such a long time on the day. So our research has basically just shown that a lot of people have to pay off car lease payments, and in addition to the fuel costs that they have to also pay, just to have some money to take home at the end of the day, it means that they have to stay on the road for that long. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on the set of incentives that workers face that lead them to be working such long hours.
So while we are looking at the absolute monetary incentives or the structures that are kind of putting certain workers to work for X number of hours, what I have seen, so I ran around 500 one-on-one interviews across top 8 cities where Ola operates. And this was not just in Ola, but also for non-Ola platform drivers. I have done this interviews. And what really surprised me was many a times people were working as a driver, not because they were looking for an employment, but more for an empowerment. Right? They were proud and they considered themselves as entrepreneurs or businessmen, and they would not like to be addressed as drivers. Right? So there is a social angle to this where they consider themselves to be at a better standing than being employed as a low wage worker. So there's a social incentive which is hard to negate when it comes to financial. So though they work extra hours and they have all these additional costs, they love the fact that they are owners of a car rather than being a wage worker elsewhere. So that's one point. And the second point is that a lot of these people also have other motivations other than just financial or social. It's primarily the boom or the investor dollars which were flowing in the terms of incentives at a good time. At that time, a lot of people entered, they made good money, and they also added more cars. However, once the investment dollars stopped flowing, the basic marketplace principles of economics came into play. And that is when they started feeling the pinch. So I know personally drivers who have earned almost more than a knowledge worker in an IT industry on a monthly basis. And over a period of 1.5 years, their earnings dropped by 50%. Right? So it's some of the outcomes we see or the ill effects that we see of these pinched drivers is also because of this effect where growth at any cost kind of mentality in the investments sent most of these platforms on a hunt for adding and scaling. And eventually, when the market economics and ROI started being considered, the ill effects were actually felt by the drivers most, who were already riddled with some debt.
Okay, thank you very much, Madhu. I think we have to stop here before handing over to Luke for the final wrap-up. I would like to say thank you to the organizers for putting up the event. Thank you to the presenters, Albert, Sabina, and Sujana. Thank you to our two guests from digital platforms, Ore and Madhu. And thank you to all the participants for your interest and for the lively discussion. And now over to you, Luke, for the wrap-up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you, Georg, for being available to moderate this session today. Considering the time that we're already overdue for 50 minutes, I will keep myself shorter than I wanted. What has become clear during this session with the presentations from the JustJobs and Cenfri, also with the Fair Work Foundation and the panel discussion, is that we are here clearly experiencing an economic transformation with all its ups and downsides. We see that platform work and gig economy, although now not as big as traditional work employment relations, it is growing and it is set to stay. What we also see, especially from the Cenfri JustJobs report, that there are scarce regulation or non-existent regulations throughout the world. So we have this lag between the technological and economic innovation and the regulation work that is coming along the way. There we have, which fits quite nicely, the presentation from Sujana and the Fair Work Foundation, who is an actor who steps in to fill up this gap with at least a self-regulation incentive to guide, first of all, consumers to what platforms are valid or respecting workers' rights, but also for the workers and the platforms themselves to benchmark them in their markets and others. What we have from EMSD as our perspective, what is the central mechanism of this economic transformation in labor markets? And these are the platforms themselves. And I want to invite, I had more points, but I want to invite just to take one step back and quickly look at what we are witnessing here in the economic, in the different economies around the world. Is a highly disruptive, a highly transformative disruption. If we have a short look only on what platforms actually do in economic sectors. While we almost always, when we talk about the digital transformation, Industry 4.0, we focus on the technological side, what has been enabled through technological features and new modes of production. I want to draw the attention more to the business models and the underlying economic foundations, why we are so convinced that platforms will play a major role in development and also in economies in general and also in development cooperation. The main feature is that platform markets are basically the winner takes it all markets. They have strong monopolistic and oligopolistic tendencies. These tendencies arise from 4 different types of feedback loops that feed into this very strong, very quick transformation of entire economic sectors. The first one, of course, is the network effects that platforms generate. In essence, network effects increase the value of a platform with every user that is additional user as it is increasing the potential for connections exponentially. This holds true for both sides, the suppliers and customers. And of course, the more users are active on a platform, the higher the utility for the single users, be it Uber drivers and passengers, being merchants on Amazon and their clients being followers on, and influencers on Instagram. The law here is the more the merrier. The second one is data generation. Digital platforms are proficient in retrieving real-time data to improve their from their users, which they feed back into their algorithms to improve, first of all, their targeting, but also their services. So this is a technical enhancer for the network effects. It's not only the crowd that gets bigger, that makes it more usable, the actual service gets better. The third one is capital. Although capital is hard to get capital investments for platforms, but the nature of platform business models is that they scale without mass and they scale extremely rapidly. So as soon as one platform takes off, it attracts a lot of investments, it attracts the lion's share of investments, and investors are prone to invest in this early adopter or in this pioneer, thus cementing their position as a dominant actor in the one platform market. And fourth and lastly, is the political economy of platforms. Susanna has already mentioned today that the very recent issue where platforms can engage very strongly in political processes, with Uber and other platform companies proposing the Proposition 22 to overturn a quite recent legislation in California to actually grant more workers' rights to platform workers. This was the most expensive campaign in the history of state plebiscites in the entire state of California. They invested 10 times more than the counter side, that would be the unions and the labor law lawyers and of course the workers. So you see that there is a vast economic power that is developing from the platforms. And combined, these four feedback loops will, in our view at least, an economy where platforms will play a central role. As Brigitte already told it in the beginning, 7 out of the 10 actually most valuable platform companies are platform-based. There, just for the future, it is more necessary than ever that regulators, platform regulators, policymakers, but also other actors consider these trends and take them into account for policymaking, for regulations, for incentivizing self-regulation from platforms, because platforms are here to stay, and as you said, they need to have a certain degree of regulation to harvest the potential they bring for economic development while mitigating the risks that they are accompanying. This was a short EMSD take on the entire platform economy, and also which is of course encompassing also the labor platforms, gig work. To finish up, I just want to thank everybody, all the panelists, all the participants that you have joined our discussion today. Also, I want to thank for your patience with us prolonging this event quite some minutes. And I want to wish you from my side and also from EMSD and the organizers, I'm sure they agree with that, a very nice day. Thank you very much for joining us. And one last logistical remark. Yes, the recording will be made available afterwards.